Tree of Heaven is not an evil plant. Let me explain. On the Rewild Pearl on Instagram, we're currently promoting one of our classes on using the Tree of Heaven for various things. And the comments are unhinged. People have the most ridiculously misplaced anger when it comes to so-called invasive species. Invasive species are not like evil colonizer plants that want to just take over everything, that have some sort of like ill intent to murder all of the other native plants in the area. It's not a metaphor for human civilization colonizing indigenous people or indigenous places. Invasive species are plants and animals that are hyper adapted to specific conditions that no longer have limits to their own growth. Oftentimes this means an animal was introduced into a place that doesn't have a natural predator there. And so they're prolific because they're adapted to be prolific wherever they're from. An example is a nutria. Nutria is a sort of a mix between a beaver and a muskrat, and they're from Ecuador. They were brought to the Northwest during the fur trade era, and when the fur trade, because they were going to be farmed, when farming nutria didn't work out, the people let them go into the wild. What happened? Well, in Ecuador, they have super high predation, so they breed 3 times a year, which is way more than beaver or muskrat. So they're adapted to a high level of predation that doesn't exist here. So they're just doing what they were doing in Ecuador here, and it's making them a lot more prolific because they're not being consumed by the predators that don't exist here, that do exist in Ecuador. Are nutria evil? Are they like intentionally destroying beaver dams and muskrat huts? Oh, no, they're not. They're just doing what nutria are supposed to do. It's not their fault. It's the same with plants. Take English ivy, for instance. English ivy is highly adapted to a specific kind of soil condition. That soil condition is often created through industrial logging practices or industrial agricultural practices. So these invasive species basically ride the wave of destruction behind colonial agriculture and urbanization, urban development, and the specific types of disturbance caused by colonial societies. The plants themselves are not colonizing, they're not invading. Civilization is invading, and these plants are adapted to the disturbance that civilization created. Oftentimes, native plants are not adapted to the new conditions, the new kind of soil damage that's been done. Soil really decides what kind of plants are growing there. So the idea of being angry at an invasive species for just doing what it's adapted to do in an environment where there aren't the same checks and balances that it had in its native habitat is ridiculous. You should be angry at urbanization. You should be angry at habitat loss. You should be angry at industrial agriculture and industrial logging. Those are the things that are creating the environmental conditions for invasive species to be prolific. They're changing the soil composition. They're reintroducing or they're introducing plants and species into places where there are no checks and balances. So Tree of Heaven is not an evil plant. Tree of Heaven is just doing what it's best adapted to do. When it comes to working with invasive species, what we have to do is become those predators that no longer exist, or not no longer, but that don't exist in these particular environments. We need to become those predators. So we have to figure out ways of inspiring people to use those plants instead of just killing them for no reason or for altruism, like, oh, I'm going to go pull ivy this weekend to be a good volunteer. That's not how humans work. Like, we actually need to have some sort of connection to the plant that is somehow useful to us. So if we can understand how things are medicinal, how they're crafty, how they're edible, those things are going to inspire way more people to go out and actually do something to manage the population of these species than just some sort of weekend altruistic, volunteer work party, right? What happens if people understand they can make baskets with English ivy or make medicine with English ivy? Or what if they understand that English ivy actually purifies the air outside and that it actually might be purifying some of the industrial chemicals that are in the air right now, that it creates habitat for newts and birds and all kinds of things. Like, there's so many good things about these plant species that are integrated or becoming integrated into ecosystems. We just have to limit their growth. We have to come up with checks and balances and understand them. And one way that we can do that is actually by interacting with them. And even to just say anything positive. We didn't, in this post that's unhinged with all these people freaking out, the funniest thing is that we didn't say anything about planting Tree of Heaven. We would never plant invasive species. We remove them and we plant native species, obviously. The soil composition's changed. Those native species might not survive, though. That's a thing. Doesn't mean we should be planting invasive species ever. They're doing fine, right? They're prolific. We want to limit their population. We didn't post anything about that specifically. We just said, here's some nice things to know about Tree of Heaven, and you're going to learn about it in this class. And just saying anything nice at all. Just being like, you don't have to hate this species. You can just appreciate it. You can appreciate the qualities that it has to offer. And people are just freaking out and posting the most unhinged stuff. Tree of Heaven, more like Tree of Hell. Just ridiculous things. And again, it's misplaced anger. That anger that you feel about so-called invasive species and what they're doing, you should feel that anger to civilization. You should feel that anger about the fact that we have this society that's completely laid waste to the environment and created conditions where these species thrive. And now it's our responsibility to understand their uses and start managing them by using them for those purposes as much as we can. If everybody wove an English ivy basket or a kudzu basket or whatever, we wouldn't have to get paper or plastic at the grocery store. We would just have those things and we'd be removing those species. There's a lot of ways of interacting with invasive species that will improve our own lives: medicine, food, crafts, natural dyes and fibers, all kinds of great stuff. You just have to get over that bias, which, by the way, that bias was in part created by Monsanto. That's right, Monsanto. You can read about it in the book Beyond the War on Invasive Species. After World War II, they needed to sell more chemical weapons because they weren't selling as much. The war was over. And so they figured out they needed a new war. And what was that war? The war on invasive species. They found a fringe scientist who was talking about invasion ecology and promoted it as a way of selling glyphosate. And they used wartime propaganda posters against so-called invasive species to sell Roundup and to sell glyphosate. And it's been this thing that's just been perpetuated ever since, that they just hate invasive species so much. And they have no idea that it stems from post-World War II Monsanto propaganda to sell Roundup. If you actually think about the conditions that create what we call invasive species, there's no reason to hate these plants at all. It's totally ridiculous. So I encourage everybody out there to get over that hate and to tell people that there's actually really great uses for all kinds of species that are out there. And the best thing that we can do is learn those things and start integrating them and become limits to growth of those species. Instead of dumping glyphosate or whatever toxic shit in the earth, that's just going to make the soil composition even worse for invasive species, or worse for native species, and encourage the disturbance that invasive species thrive in. Dumping poison herbicides into the soil, pesticides into the soil, is actually just doing the service of invasive species. It's changing the soil so much more that now native species won't be able to live in that particular soil composition. So we really have to figure out how to interact with these species on a personal, unique, cultural level, like weaving baskets, like eating food, like Japanese knotweed is filled with reversetol. I don't know how to say it. It's some chemical that's very potent medicine. It's great for Lyme's disease, which is starting to spread all across the US and heading towards the West Coast. There's people here that have already got it. So there's medicine here that's being brought here. Knotweed is also a really great spring vegetable. You can make paper out of it. You can make fiber. There's all kinds of things. We just have to actually start integrating with our landscapes again, instead of just relying on industrial agriculture and industrial products for everything. If we were actually making things and engaging with the land around us, we wouldn't be participating in this culture that's destroying the environment and creating conditions for invasive species to begin with. All right, that was my rant. I love all of the invasive species that I work with, and I don't blame them for their existence or doing what they were adapted to do. And I charge everybody here to get involved in some way or another in learning about the uses of invasive species and befriending them, and also, condemning industrial agriculture, condemning industrial logging, and all of the other massive destructive projects that have created the conditions for this.